Squirrels! So hello, and welcome to another Legends of Runeterra video. My name is Chris, and as you can see, today we are doing something a little bit different because we're going to talk about Ionia and how careful we have to be with Ionia. And this is my response to a lot of people saying, you know, oh, buff these cards in Ionia, oh, buff this card in Ionia, right? And I've seen a lot of suggestions for different cards, and, you know, not all of them, but quite a few of them I think are pretty bad ideas, and I'm going to explain why. And what I've done here is I've got up 3 Ionia decks from the past. Now, they're not exactly the list that ended up, you know, dominating or whatever, but they're 3 Ionian decks that ended up being like top meta decks. Probably the #1 deck at a certain point. As I say, they're not the exact list. This one is the early elusive decks that I think ended up going for allegiance rather than so many Freljord cards, but that's by the by. The point is, you get what the list is trying to do. It's what it is, right? And this one you can see came from about a year ago at this point, which is kind of crazy to think about as well, but it really was that long ago. And so let's talk about these 3 decks and why Ionia might be a bit different than other regions with regards to its balance. So a quick spoiler alert, the 3 decks we're going to be talking about are Elusive Freljord here with Ionia, as you can see, Karma Ezreal, and Lee Sin Targon. And aside from the fact they're all Ionia decks, they also have one thing in common as well, and that is that they are terrible, terrible decks to play against. Now you might think, oh Chris, you know, these decks were all top of the meta, you know, and everyone hates whatever the top meta deck is. That's just true all the time. And I actually think that that isn't true all of the time. I think, in fact, what you get some of the time is that, yes, people hate the top deck. You can say something like TF Fizz, you know, people are kind of sick of that deck. And if something reigns for a very long time, then yes, people will eventually get sick of that deck. But just because you're the top deck doesn't mean that people will, you know, call for you to just nerf it out of extinction. And there are a few examples I think we can draw upon. There was once upon a time where Ashe Noxus was the top deck, and that deck only received 1 nerf to my recollection, and that was Trifarian Assessor going from 4 to 5 mana. Not the biggest nerf the deck could have received, and kind of, I think, showed that people were, you know, not that unhappy with the deck. Yeah, maybe it's a bit too good, but we don't need to kill it. It's fine to stay around, even if it was still tier 1. Another example you could use is, of course, Draven Ezreal, a more recent example, and in that case, you know, we've seen, what, Farron get nerfed, and I believe that's the only one from that deck. Maybe there are others, but, you know, again, just a kind of deck that was tier 1, was probably the best deck for a little while there, and, you know, it didn't receive any major nerfs to it because people were okay with it being a good deck. And then we come to Ionia, and that hasn't quite been the case for these Ionian decks, because unlike those examples I just gave, these were at one point the top deck, and they all got a lot of hate and some very significant nerfs because people hated them so much. So let's start with Elusives. Of course, this was, you know, a long time ago at this point, and, you know, so long ago that Deny was 3 mana. And the idea of this deck was you played a bunch of Elusives, you buffed them up with Omen Hawk, you used Deny to stop any, you know, attempt at, you know, getting rid of your units, a common theme, I should say, in some of these decks, and, you know, you essentially won because they couldn't block any of your units. Hey, what a neat idea. We haven't seen that since, right? There's no problem with that since. I could make a whole video on that. I might do one day about the elusive problem as well. But this is the deck that kind of started off the elusive problem, and yeah, it's kind of continued ever since. And again, not fun to play against. I can't block any of your units. You have to remember this isn't a time, you know, before like Sharp Sight or anything like that. There wasn't really any way to block elusives other than to have elusive units, and if you tried to remove them through more conventional means, then you would just get denied, which wasn't great either. Moving on, we have Karma Ezreal, which again followed a similar pattern of being very unfun to play against, because essentially it was, oh, it's turn 10, okay, the game is over now, you know, and I'll just wait 5 minutes for you eventually to kill me. You know, that's kind of what this deck was. Oh, you didn't win by turn 10? Well, unlucky. That's a shame, because now the game is over. And that's how this deck essentially played. Again, not very fun to play against. And then third, And I'm sure you'll all remember this one. Of course, Lee Sin Targon, back when Lee Sin was 4 mana, of course, was completely oppressive. It's still a decent deck today, but back then, of course, it was rather not great to play against. And again, followed that same pattern of, I've put Lee Sin down, I've given him Overwhelm, his attack is 10. Can you do anything? Yes, I'll try my Vengeance or whatever. Well, I'll deny that. Again, not very fun to play against, and they all share the same sort of idea that they're not fun to play against for, I think a main reason is that essentially none of your decisions mattered. In any of these cases, if you were playing against any of these decks, it didn't matter really what you did, because if they happened to find the right cards, then you just lost, and that was that. And so I think we have to be very careful when we look at the cards that should be buffed in Ionia. So when you look through some of the suggestions for cards that people want to buff, you will often see, cards like Scales of the Dragon, which I've already talked about why that's a bad card to buff, or Elusives, right? People want Elusives to come back. Both of those, I think, are terrible ideas. And the reason why is because they promote these three kind of decks. These are the kind of decks that they promote, right? Just kind of, yeah, they're good. Yeah, you could make Ionia better if you do that. But it won't be fun to play against. It'll be horrific to play against. It's not what you want to buff. These are the kind of things you want to buff. The support archetype, right? Lulu has been a champion that, has seen very little play, and would be nice to see Lulu succeed and be in a tier 1 deck. That would be a lot of fun, I think. And so I'd be looking at these collection of cards here and go, right, okay, which ones can we improve? And just look to improve them, in some cases, maybe quite heavily. And, take Lulu from, the deepest depths of a meta tier list or whatever, and bring her up to, a high tier 2, tier 1 deck. Why not? I think that would be refreshing. It would be a different way for Ionia to go than it has done before, because, as I've mentioned, those top decks from Ionia before have all been oppressive and not fun to play against, whereas I think Lulu would provide a much more balanced atmosphere to an Ionian deck where the decisions that you make do matter. Things that actually matter in the game. Them being good at the game and having a certain attack order also matters, and understanding what options you might have. There is a chess match that's going on in that game. Whereas with other Ionia decks, as we've shown, there isn't no chess match. It's turn 10. I've got Karma leveled up. The game is over. That's no chess match. This is going to be much more of a chess match archetype, and that is what makes it a lot more fun. So I'd be looking to buff the support archetype, which I think is a fairly common, popular view that should be the case, right? But I also have one more for you. And that one more is the stun archetype, because whilst there isn't many stun cards in Ionia, something else that I think maybe needs looking at, and perhaps they could look at that as well, because I think Yasuo is more of a stun champion than a recall champion, so they could look at, kind of, helping Yasuo out there, but looking to buff, maybe not these cards. Some people have suggested buffing Yone and make him draw Yasuo, which I kind of like that idea, by the way. But, whether it's the Noxus stun package or the Targon stun package, even with Daybreak and Leona, right? Even if you want to buff them, that's fine. But I think looking at ways to improve Yasuo and making Yasuo a, very viable, good champion, that would also be quite nice as well. So those are the two different archetypes I'd look at buffing. In conclusion, basically, Ionia sits on a knife edge. Either it can, go one way and be bad for quite some time, as it has been, as we are now, or it can go the other way and be very oppressive, because the type of decks that Ionia runs don't really allow for much counterplay or much decision making that impacts the outcome of the game. And so, therefore, I would say be very, very careful with what you buff in Ionia, Riot, because, well, if you buff the wrong thing and you turn the dial up on the wrong one, people aren't going to be happy. We've already seen it with Lee Sin once when you tried to, buff Ionia in one way, and it backfired in a big way. So I would be very careful about what we buff in Ionia. And yeah, let me know what you guys think about this. I'm very excited for this next upcoming balance patch. I know it's still some time away, but I'm very hyped for it. So let me know what cards in Ionia you might buff, because I do agree that the region does need some help, but I think we do also need to be careful with the kind of things that we buff in Ionia. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.